Hey everyone, welcome to another Patreon topic video. This one is for Tsugumo, and the topic is RNG within Shmups. More specifically, how does RNG affect competitive gameplay? So how does it affect the games that players are gravitating towards, or how does it affect the modes that players find more appealing or more fair than others? Those types of things. And so I think the first thing I want to do is just explain what RNG is. So RNG stands for Random Number Generation. It is basically the randomized or luck-based variance of gameplay elements from run to run or credit to credit. So an example that comes to my mind is Stage 2 boss in Battle Garega. So in Battle Garega there are a fair amount, to say the least, of RNG elements or random-based elements in the game. One that comes to my mind is the Stage 2 boss, where each time you play you never know exactly what that boss is going to do. Not only is its movement randomized, but also its attack patterns are randomized, so you can't always predict exactly what is going to happen. And you can compare that with something like the Stage 2 boss in Danmaku Unlimited 3, where it is going to do the exact same thing every time consistently, because that boss does not really have many RNG elements. And so Tsugumo himself has actually provided an example from Doom speedrunning, that is. So in Doom, the original one, there is a speedrunning category known as 100% kill. So that would be, I'm assuming, killing all the enemies on the map before exiting. And Tsugumo is explaining that this mode is not very popular for speedrunning because of the high RNG elements within it. Because not only is the damage of your weapons randomized, but also the enemy locations are going to be randomized as well. So it's going to rely a lot on luck, whereas something that has less RNG can maybe be a combination of luck and rehearsal. So let's just start off by kind of dividing the two extremes, I guess, of how RNG could work in a game. So on one spectrum you could have no RNG, no randomization whatsoever. I think Danmaku Unlimited 3 is pretty close to this, where almost nothing in the game is randomized at all. Everything is predictive, everything is going to happen the same way every single time, so it's all going to come down to just learning your routing and learning exactly what you need to do and executing. So it's all about routing and execution. There's no need for adaptation on the fly. Whereas you could take another game, maybe a roguelike or something like that, where there is no routing, there is no consistency, because the randomization is so high that it's all going to come down to how adaptable is the player. How quickly can the player think on his feet and change what he or she is doing to match the situation. And so those do test very different skills, obviously, because routing is going to be very heavy on one, and then adaptability is going to be very heavy on the other. Personally speaking, I like kind of in that wavelength. I like it to be mostly RNG free, but with a little dash of it in there, a hint of it. So a game that comes to my mind that is like this, that's a little more RNG heavy than I think people realize, is, the game I always play and talk about, Dodonpachi. So Dodonpachi actually has a fair amount of RNG elements within it. Some that big ones that come to mind is definitely that Stage 3 mid-boss, especially in the second loop, where you never know what its bullets are going to do. So it has this bullet, then it explodes out into a bunch of smaller bullets and you have to dodge them. When it does that and how it does that is randomized, so you never quite know what you're going to get. And I've tried many times to kind of figure out some sort of manipulation, and I really don't think there is. Another one that comes to mind that I like to call the lottery is the Stage 1 mid-boss. It's not a big deal in the first loop, obviously, but in the second loop, you can get a very easy pattern on that, where you just stand in front of him and shoot him and you basically kill him. Or you can get an extremely tough pattern where it throws out overlapping shots and you have to do the very, very tight dodge, even if you know it's coming. So that's another example of randomization. There's more elements, like obviously Hibachi and what Hibachi does. There's a lot of randomness to that boss fight. Also, one that's a little less recognized is the Stage 1-6 boss. So its final pattern, it shoots these blue spears, and those blue spears are randomized, and that actually can be kind of a pain in the butt a lot of the time, because you can be doing really well, and then there's a lot of reaction that that really tests your adaptability much more than a lot of other patterns. And so I think cave games do a really good job for the most part with their randomization, where they are mostly predictive, they're mostly able to consistently deliver on your routes and stuff, but then they'll throw in some curveballs, and they'll throw in, especially with boss fights, some randomized elements, like with bullet patterns and things like that, to keep you on your toes, to make it so it's not completely stale, not completely just paint by the numbers. And so I think it'd be interesting to talk about more examples of how RNG can sort of affect the player's psychology and the different ways it can play into it, because I think adding a little bit of RNG can be healthy for a game, something like Dononpachi or DOJ, but you can also be very unhealthy for a game. So let's think of some unhealthy examples. One that comes to mind that I've heard players talk about, I don't really play this game competitively, but in Futari, the icicles in Stage 2 are a huge problem for Rico, and it involves a lot of RNG, and I've heard both Gus and SMC explain that playing 1.5 mode can be absolutely just painful because of the amount of RNG in Stage 2. And so I would find that probably a little bit on the unhealthy side of things, because if you're getting a lot of resets due to strictly to RNG, I think that's starting to hurt the competitiveness of the gameplay, or it's starting to affect kind of the appeal of it. Another important and interesting factor to think about is where the RNG takes place within the run, because certain places RNG can be less troublesome than other places. So in Dononpachi, the RNG of Hibachi himself, right? So from a survival perspective, that's not a lot of fun, because you would love for Hibachi to be more predictive and things like that. And there's actually been a few 2-all attempts I had before I finally got one where I was doing really well, and then the final attack occurred, and if Hibachi sits low on the screen, you're basically dead. And so I got this final attack where Hibachi was just hanging out at the bottom of the screen for way longer than he normally does, and it basically just killed my run. And I wasn't even upset at myself, because there's really nothing I could do, but it was a bummer, obviously. So stuff like that can be absolutely brutal, but at the same time, if you're playing for score, having that RNG element of Hibachi at the end, yes, if you're a badass and you're going to get a lot of extends to cash in with, that can be an issue. But for the most part, if you're like just kind of your average-ish Dononpachi player who's usually going to barely get that clear, it actually isn't going to affect your score that much whether Hibachi murders you or not in the final attack, for instance. It's just going to be a bummer because you don't get the clear. However, again, talking about Dononpachi, when it comes to scoring, the 2-3 mid-boss is a huge issue for scoring because of its randomization. So like I said, you never know how that ball's going to explode and blast out at you. And the 2-3 is like a linchpin for the run, where if you die on that attack, your run's over, basically. You can bomb it for a pretty hefty score penalty, which is pretty interesting to think about. Actually, I'll get more to that point in a little bit here. But I just want to talk about some other elements of RNG that I've heard people mention before I start getting into specific examples again. So another one that I always think about is with shorter games and shorter gameplay experiences. The one that I'm more aware of is in GoldenEye speedrunning. And R. White Goose talks about this a lot in his Speed Lore series, where a lot of GoldenEye stages involve a ton of RNG. However, the way they look at, a lot of the players look at the RNG in that game is, from run to run, it is absolutely brutal. But since the runs are so short, the RNG kind of becomes a consistency check, where it's basically saying, can you create 100 or so world record pace runs consistently, and then one of them will cash out to be the record. And so I think that's an interesting way to look at RNG, where it does in some ways test your consistency if it's implemented in a somewhat fair fashion. So again, with getting back to Donanpachi, that 2-3 mid-boss, let's say you decide not to bomb that and you decide to dodge it. A player who's going to be very consistent at getting to 2-3 effectively, without dropping their chain, without dropping their max bonus, basically playing really well up to that point, is going to be actually a little bit rewarded for his consistency, because if he loses one run to that mid-boss, he can just fire up another credit and get right back there. Whereas a player like myself, if I get to that 2-3 mid-boss without dropping my max, without doing too many mess-ups with my chaining, that's like a huge moment. That's a big deal. And so if I died during that mid-boss attack, it would be absolutely devastating. So it would reward someone who's more consistent, which is an interesting way to think about it. However, if the game gets too RNG heavy and it gets too oppressive, I think it's gonna, like Tsugumo points out with Doom, right, where it's just there's just so much luck involved that it doesn't matter how good or consistent you are, it's just not going to reward you. It's just going to all come down to luck. That's where I think it starts to cross over to being sort of unhealthy or uninteresting for players to start tackling. And there's also other things to consider, like how much does the RNG affect your score, right, or affect your goal. So there are lots of different examples within shmups where maybe the RNG will force you to bomb early, or it'll force you to use a resource that you normally don't need to. But the way the scoring system's set up is that's not a massive penalty. It's not like in Donanpachi where you take that bomb and you get a huge score penalty, but for safety. There are other games where maybe there's RNG elements, but your penalties are smaller. And I think, again, those can be healthy because they can kind of build up on themselves and test your consistency. The test, okay, not only do you have your routing in place, but you also are able to adapt to all these different little situations, and then you're rewarded, slightly for doing that, but without being totally penalized. So I think that's a nice middle ground. So before I close this topic, I want to finish by talking about another element of RNG that I find very, very interesting, which is when it comes to how it affects your strategic planning or your strategic overview of how you're going to approach scoring. And so the specific example I'm going to talk about that I mentioned before is this 2-3 mid-boss in Donanpachi. And actually the bees as well. The bees aren't randomized per se, but there's nothing random about the bees, but they do add less consistency. But I'll leave those off the table. So with that 2-3 mid-boss, most of the players that I'm aware of are going to take that gamble and try and dodge that attack, because they have the consistency, or a somewhat consistency, to get to that point over and over. However, for me, I am greatly considering bombing that mid-boss and taking the score penalty. And the reason why is I'm trying to think about it in a sort of macro sense rather than in a specific run ideal scenario type thing. So I'm trying to think, if I play Donanpachi where I'm making all these small concessions to the RNG, like I'm perhaps setting up less optimal chain routes, like by not collecting bees, for example. That's one reason why I'm thinking about not collecting bees. It's because in different stages and things like that, you have a little more freedom to do what you want to do because you're not really constrained by those bees. But anyway, so that's granting me more consistency there for a little smaller RNG elements. But then if I also bomb that 2-3 mid-boss, that removes another RNG element, which improves my consistency. So even though my ideal max total will never reach something like what Jamer's achieved, it's also going to be more likely that I achieve a higher-ish score, like a 400 mil. So that's another interesting aspect about RNG to think about, is it can kind of diverge how players are going to approach the game, where you're going to have some players who are going to basically face the RNG head on, high risk, high reward gameplay, and then you're going to have other players like myself who are going to try and maybe reduce the RNG's effects, but at the cost of their overall score or time if it's in speedrunning. And you actually see this a lot. And so again, that's another reason why I think RNG is interesting to have in a game. I do think it's a good thing overall, but as long as it's within reason, as long as it's balanced. Because if you have no RNG whatsoever, it does start to feel a little bit stale, right? Because it just really does come down to learning and execution. And as a player, I do like the idea of players being tested on their adaptability as well as their learning and execution. So you get more of a comprehensive type of skill test rather than strictly, you know, A to B, B to C type things. So I'd be interested to hear to think what everyone else's RNG thoughts are, because it is a really interesting topic. And I think basically how RNG works in your mind when you're playing is when you get good RNG, you're like, oh, RNG isn't a big deal, you know, it's not a problem. And then when you have a really clutch run like I did with that Hibachi fight in one of my attempts, and then Hibachi just sits on the bottom of the screen the whole time, then you start to really, really despise RNG and be like, this is stupid, RNG shouldn't ever be in games. And so that shmups are full of RNG. Some of it intended, some of it definitely not intended. And so it is actually pretty unusual to find a shmup that doesn't have it. I think more modern indie shmups are sort of starting to really reduce down on the RNG, which I think, if it's done correctly, is a good thing, right? Because some shmups can just have absolutely absurd amounts of RNG that make them, again, sort of unappealing, sort of feel like you're fighting an uphill battle unnecessarily. So anyway, before I close out, let me thank my patrons: Joe Angelo, John, Kay, Quentin, Maz, Nathaniel Davis, N Electron, Okla Kugels, Almcall, Rysosis, Tsugumo, Man of the Video, Young Money Swee, Plasmo, Utakaya, Bahoy TV 100, Malaise, Meher Calendrian, Dingo, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Brian Shiver, Double Vision, Deps 20XX, Dunpeel 2064, EC2151, Full Set Retro Schmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Jacob Spring, and Jake Ryan. Thanks for watching.